Welcome to Comply or Die, risky chat from beyond the tick box. I'm Ian Gulliford, and with over 30 years in health and safety consultancy, I can tell you compliance doesn't end at the tick box, it's just the beginning. Each episode, I sit down with a frontline professional who's got a compelling story to tell or a bold opinion to share about the real world of compliance. Because beyond the dashboards and the risk assessments, there's a human element, messy, real, and full of insights. Let's get started. Today, we are discussing asbestos, another generation at risk. And joining me from her office in Loughborough is Liz Darlison MBE. Liz is currently a consultant nurse at University Hospital Leicester, where she has enjoyed over 40 years of clinical practice. She's passionate about improving experience and outcomes through clinical research, and she keenly promotes the NHS and nursing as a career. In response to patient need in 2004, Liz established Mesothelioma UK, a national charity dedicated to improving the lives of those living with mesothelioma and to help prevent future cases. She is CEO of the charity full-time while still a practicing nurse, and in 2019, in the Queen Elizabeth's birthday honours list, Liz was invited to become a member of the British Empire MBE, in recognition of her services to patients and cancer research. She also has honorary university positions in both Leicester and Sheffield, and in May 2024, she was appointed as Deputy Lieutenant for Leicestershire. Welcome, Liz. Obviously, we're going to be talking a lot about asbestos. That's the whole point for today. It's a subject that, for me, is very important. I've spent my entire career in asbestos consultancy. And obviously, it's very important to you and incredibly important to you. There's so much to talk about, but let's start at the beginning. My intro for you, I have to say, I think, doesn't really do you very much justice. So please tell us a little bit more about you, Liz, and how you came to create Mesothelioma UK.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Well, like I said, I'm a nurse, over 40 years practice. I started when I was 18, and heart disease is my family's curse. So I was very dedicated to working in coronary care, and that's where I was going to build my career. And went and did a bit of work on a respiratory ward for experience, because in order to get on in a coronary care unit or intensive care unit, you had to have some ward experience. And I went to respiratory and never left, and got involved in lung cancer in the year 2000. And when I was working with lung cancer patients, I started to meet these people with mesothelioma, and it was just pitiful. Back in the early 2000s, there wasn't one licensed treatment for these patients. There wasn't an information booklet to give them. Macmillan Cancer Support were the provider of information. At the time, they didn't have an information booklet. And so along with the support of colleagues and the amazing University Hospitals of Leicester who supported me, I put in an application to Macmillan Cancer Support to establish a bespoke mesothelioma support service for Macmillan Cancer Support. The UK has had then and still has the highest incidence of mesothelioma in the world, and it felt wrong that these desperate people being diagnosed couldn't even find an information booklet about their disease. They couldn't pick up the phone to a support line and ask for help and advice. And Macmillan, granted me and the team at Leicester Hospitals a really substantial grant. And in 2004, we established the National Macmillan Mesothelioma Resource Centre. Macmillan pump primed us for a few years, but then in order to sustain the services, we had to launch as an independent charity, which we did in 2008, 2009. And that's how it started, with just 2 whole-time equivalents. There were actually 3 of us, but part-timers. And we just grew from there.
And how big is the charity now?
I mean, we were just, there was just a few of us up until 2012, and that's when we started to expand. It took a few years to get some finances behind us in order to expand. So all of the growth happened from 2012 onwards. We are now just short of about 47, 48 staff. We've got 29 nurses. So we fund 29 nurses, all working at the coalface of the NHS, our amazing healthcare system. and then we've got 18 in the ops team. That's a lot of part-time staff, works out about 12 full-time equivalents. And for the size of charity, our income's about 1.7 million. For the size of charity, we are probably under-resourced. Well, we're definitely under-resourced in the ops team, but it's evolving all the time. So we do need to expand, particularly our fundraising team. We have some amazing fundraisers and people who support us, and looking after them, and you know supporting them with their fundraising takes quite a lot of effort and support. So we do need to grow our fundraising team, definitely. But yeah, so 1.7 million and 18 in the ops team and 29 nurses. We've got a team of volunteers as well, people who take photographs for us, proofread for us, stand at events and so on. And then we've also got an amazing board of trustees. The thing that probably makes us quite unique, I think, is that we are extremely clinically led. So, as I say, I'm a nurse consultant still practicing in the NHS, and our board of trustees, the chair of the board is a professor of respiratory medicine, and we've got two other medical professors on there, a very senior NHS nurse, as well as lawyers, accountant, blah, blah, blah. But we are very, very clinically led and very much embedded in the NHS. We are all about making the NHS the very best it can be. And being embedded in the NHS is crucial to achieving that.
That's amazing. I have to say, it's what you've just said there is way beyond anything that I thought that Mesothelioma UK were doing, and I'm really interested to know how many patients with mesothelioma you see across the year, and do all mesothelioma sufferers end up coming through your charity and through your nursing care, or is it just a proportion of them? How does that work?
So I wish they did. I wish that every mesothelioma patient had contact with us. But no, they don't. And if I'm honest, we are not great at keeping tabs on all of the contact that we have, because with 29 individuals out there, as I say, at the front door of the NHS, and a support line and support groups that we run, and we've got courses and so many platforms, social media platforms. So I would estimate that somewhere around about 60% of mesothelioma patients in this country, we absolutely have good statistics that they contact us. But I suspect there are a lot more that we've not actually captured that. So about 60%. There's 2,700 cases a year in the UK.
Sure.
The NHS is divided regionally for cancer services, and there are we've got Scotland pretty much covered, Northern Ireland covered, Wales a little bit patchy. And in England, there are, I think, around about 21 regions, and we have nurses in all but 6 of them. So that gives you some idea of, that we do miss some parts of the country because we haven't got a nurse in that area.
Yeah.
But we're growing. We're growing.
So, Liz, I think one of the other questions I wanted to ask there, you said you've got some very high level professors working with a charity, or you work with them. Do you do research into mesothelioma care? Is that part of the charity's work, or is that part of the NHS's work?
Oh my goodness me. Do you know, it's so hard to uh, get funding for research. It's really hard. I mean, there are 200 different types of cancer. The vast majority of people, over 50% of people, just around about 50% of people, when they're diagnosed, are diagnosed with either breast, bowel, lung, or prostate, the top 4. So it stands to reason that a lot of research resources go into those top 4 cancers. So, the smaller cancers like mesothelioma, it's really hard to secure any funding for research. I have to say, increasingly, the more we learn about cancer generally, um, the more the more evidence that is transferable to other cancers, because it's about what's happening at a cellular level, um, and things that drive cancer, and switch cancers on and off, and are familiar across different cancers. So we do benefit from cancer in research into other cancers, or cancer generally. Um, But for mesothelioma specifically, there's no government funding set aside for mesothelioma research. The charity does fund research. I think it's probably somewhere 1.5 million, that kind of money we've spent on audit and research since we started. We have our own research centre at the University of Sheffield. So we have funded that for 5 years now. They're prolific. That is very much patient experience research. So we look at things that matter to patients, how they were told they've got mesothelioma, about the anxiety associated with having a scan. We've also done some work to expose what I call discrete cohorts of patients. So, our team of nurses, it's the first time we've had a national team of healthcare professionals dedicated to this disease, and between them, they have, raised concern about the number of people they're seeing not working in careers, particularly associated with asbestos exposure. So, and our experience, our anecdote, doesn't really hold water when you're trying to change policy or trying to effect change in terms of asbestos management. And so we had to evidence base that experience. And so we've completed, or when I say we, our research team at Sheffield have completed studies to really explore the effect of asbestos in our veterans, so people in the armed forces, because our nurses very concerned about the number of veterans they were looking after. And then we've done similar studies to look at healthcare workers, because we were looking after so many doctors and nurses being diagnosed and living and dying with mesothelioma. And then again with teachers, education workers. So that's 3 studies that our team have completed that really have rigorously evidence based that asbestos is not the really nasty effects of asbestos are not limited to people working in construction or power stations or lagging. Its presence is so widespread in our country, and there's no safe level of exposure, that there are all these other people that collectively, as a team of nurses, were recognising that are being dreadfully affected by very minimal exposure.
Picking up on that, then I saw you speak at an ATAC conference a couple of years ago, and um, I have to say, I think it's one of the things that's really made a big impact on how I view asbestos and asbestos management. And I think that's probably true for the vast majority of the British public as well. I think if they were to really understand asbestos and mesothelioma. Um, so one thing that really struck me from your "Don't Let the Dust Settle" video, which you showed at the time, and I think is still available on your website,
Yeah.
was the age of the people that
Mhm.
were on that video. That they're so young in terms of, w- I think there's a perception that mesothelioma is a disease of the past, and it's for the older generations of people who have been working in and around shipyards and construction, and they were putting asbestos in and altering it over decades. But that's not wholly the case, as you were just saying. For me, I think it's the generational thing, and the podcast is, entitled "Another Generation at Risk." Um, if you look at the timeline for asbestos in particular, it's 100 years. It's more than 100 years since the first asbestos-related death was recorded. It's getting on for 55, nearly 60 years since the first asbestos regulations that were specific to asbestos came into force. And it's 20 years, over 20 years, since the duty to manage asbestos was brought into effect. So these are generational gaps in our understanding and in our legislation and our control systems, if you like. And I find it very difficult to continue to be around asbestos and still having to have the same conversations over and over again. And I was struck in doing some recent awareness training, and also the UCREEF uh, forum that was on earlier this year in Leeds, that there's a lot of new graduates working in the construction and property management industries, and these are people who are going to be looking at compliance, generally health, safety, fire. Fire, of course, is a very big thing at the moment, but they were all born after the introduction
Yeah.
of the duty to manage, and their experience of asbestos and asbestos in buildings is very much coloured by the new way that we're working, and with dashboards, uh, tick boxes, all of this kind of technology to tell people whether they're compliant or not. But actually, there's nothing about the pragmatic, practical approach, how you're actually going to deal with things. I was interested to just ask you, um, from the patients that you see, how many patients are you seeing that are very young? Give us a sense for the numbers that are involved, that are people who aren't working in these trades, that they're just being accidentally or incidentally exposed to asbestos just in the workplace.
The numbers of young people is small. There is a latency between being exposed to asbestos and developing mesothelioma or any asbestos related disease. And I think that's probably, you mentioned fire safety there. And I've sat in health and safety meetings where I've had to sit and listen to talks about falls from a height endlessly. Um, and yet over 5,000 people a year die because of asbestos. And it's just a handful of people that are affected by the fire in the workplace or falls from a height and so on. And I think it's because it's not instant. That latency, it takes so many years from being exposed to developing, but there is no safe level. The number of young people with mesothelioma um, is increasing, but the numbers are very small. So I don't want to be alarmist about it. But you're absolutely right that, I mean, anybody who is under the age of 60 should have worked and lived in a much safer uh, UK than people older than that, because we legislated heavily in the 80s. 70s, 80s, we legislated, we banned in 1999. And so all of these people should have been in a much safer asbestos environment. And, I've got to just tip my hat to our asbestos industry. That includes training, surveyors, removers, analysts. We have the most amazing asbestos protection, prevention, removal industry in the UK. And maybe because that's been so good, maybe because we've had the legislation, maybe that's why we've got a bit complacent and overlooked the fact that there is no safe level. There is no safe level of exposure. And yes,
Yeah.
young people, young doctors, young teachers, young people are living and dying of mesothelioma in our country, and they needn't be. They needn't be.
I think it's the whole thing. I find very disturbing, and hugely shocking that the numbers are so big compared to all the other health and safety related deaths that we might have, and deaths in construction. 5,000 a year dying from asbestos related diseases is a shocking number, whichever way you look at it.
Yeah.
And to say that we have had a period of very strong legislation and change in legislation, but it doesn't really seem to have had a tremendous effect in reducing the numbers. The latest statistics are showing a decline, and I hope to see that will continue on that path. There's no guarantee that that's the case, um, but I think from my point of view, the duty to manage was great. I think it changed the legislation from a very implicit style of legislation to a very explicit. You must now go and find asbestos in your buildings, and you must manage the risks from that. And I think there was a race to get asbestos surveys done, and continuing along that vein for the last 20 years, people have been doing lots of asbestos surveys up and down the country, housing stock in particular, vast quantities of surveys. But to me, there's a disconnect between actually going out and finding the asbestos in buildings and then doing something about it.
Yeah.
There doesn't seem to be there is a requirement in law to manage asbestos and have a management plan, but I think that element of the legislative framework is not very well taken up by the country, if you like, by businesses and property owners. It's very much a tick box exercise. I've got one example, which a colleague told me this story from earlier on in the year. A very large institution which has got quite a large estate of properties, lots of surveys done. On the face of it, managing asbestos very well. They've got surveys, reports, they've got databases, dashboards, they've got a management plan. But in a room or a large area where they had spray coating on the ceiling, big chunks of that fell down through the storms at the start of the year. And that happened overnight. But the next morning, when it was discovered by the cleaning staff who didn't know what it was, and they swept it all up, swept it away. And then it was only when the property team came in to look that it was identified that it was asbestos that had fallen from the ceiling. And to me, that's a management plan that, whilst in paper it's doing the job, but in practice it's far from ideal. We've got people who clearly weren't informed about the presence of asbestos. They didn't know what to do when it was on the floor, so they weren't very suitably trained, and that just shows that the whole thing just really failed at the point when it was most needed. It failed catastrophically, and I don't think that's a unique instance. I think that happens far too often.
It isn't a unique in I had a senior health and safety person who I met with not long ago in the NHS about something not related to what I do for a living, but she'd been moved over from one site to another site, and I asked her how she felt. Is it nice working on the new site? She goes, "Oh, it's much easier to park." And she said, "Oh, in my old office on one of the other hospital sites, I had stickers all over the ceiling saying 'Beware asbestos.'" And she didn't know what my clinical role was. And she said to me, "I presume it's a safe kind of asbestos, because they wouldn't let me work in a room that had dangerous asbestos." And I just thought, that's a very well educated senior person working in HR in the NHS, and she has no idea that there is no safe type of asbestos or safe
Yeah.
level of exposure. And there are endless stories I could tell you of, what I've learned over the years of very, you know, I don't, we're good at, maybe we're good at the compliance, we're good at the surveying, we're good at ticking the boxes, like you say, but the realities are, you know, I've worked in the NHS all my life. I have to complete 34 mandatory training modules to be able to practice as a nurse in the NHS. And in all of those 40 odd years, in all of those health and safety, which is every 3 years, it's on starting employment and then every 3 years, never once has it been mentioned to me that the hospitals I work in have asbestos in them, or what it looks like, or if you're worried about a crumbling wall or a hole in, the ceiling, and you're worried about asbestos, who you should ring and what you should do about it. There is
Yeah.
no system in place for that. And here's the other thing, my background is I ended up working in respiratory. I did advanced courses in respiratory. I was a ward manager on a respiratory ward dedicated to respiratory disease. I did postgraduate courses in respiratory disease. Never once, as a respiratory healthcare professional, have I been educated about asbestos and the diseases it causes. And so the whole journey from, how we look after asbestos in our homes, in our workplaces, just in the fabric of, our country, to how we identify the diseases it causes, the whole journey needs a root and branch review, because we are failing, because people are dying. Meso UK started in 2004. In 2005, me and one of my patients and a whole other kind of army of people dedicated long before me to asbestos and the diseases it causes. But myself and this patient, we went to 10 Downing Street and we presented a petition, um, the patient's charter, and it was from that Action Meso Day started. That was in 2005. Do you know 40,000 people have died as a consequence since then? And I look back on my career and I just think, okay, this, amazing to get an MBE and, the awards and the recognition, all the rest of it. But surely we failed.
Yeah.
Surely we failed.
Massively. And I think it
40,000 people, 25 Hillsboroughs go down every year because we are not managing our asbestos legacy efficiently in our country. And all these people, 40,000 in the time that we've had Meso UK, and it's 96% preventable disease. That's got to be wrong.
I think it's mind blowing
Ah,
in all of the wrong ways. I think one of the things that you've just said there that really strikes a chord is you're working on a respiratory ward in respiratory medicine, and asbestos isn't mentioned once in any of your training, and
no.
yet 5,000 people are dying because of that
Yeah,
very thing every year.
yeah,
And I'm
yeah,
sure that there are a lot of other people dying from other sources
yeah.
that go through a respiratory ward, but that merits discussion.
Yeah, and it's not a blame game. It's not a blame game. It's just this is everybody's problem. This is, it is everyone's problem.
From my world, over the last 30 years, I see the same kind of reaction to asbestos over and over and over again. Um, those in charge of property or those who are meant to be looking after property, if there's an incident of any sort, or if we're doing work on or around asbestos for any reason, um, there's always an element of, oh, let's don't tell anybody we're doing it. Don't use the asbestos word. Let's not talk about it. And I think that's entirely the wrong approach. I've said to everybody that I've ever met in those instances that you need to front it up. You need to tell people what's happening, because as soon as you go to them with what's happening and what you're doing about it and how you're dealing with it and what's going to happen, you reduce all of the levels of anxiety and upset and potential for conflict, because you appear to be knowing what you're talking about and doing something about it. You're doing the right thing. The more you try and hide, the more suspicious people become,
Yeah, yeah,
and it causes this friction and horrible and a terrible situation. It makes projects incredibly hard to manage. But it's this: let's not talk about it.
yeah.
Well, we do need to talk about it, because people are not really learning over these, as I say, these huge generational gaps from knowledge to death, and we're not continuing to keep this focus on asbestos and drive that whole thing forwards and make it something that we do need to manage.
I'm a real glass half full person. I don't think I could have worked with this disease for so many years if I wasn't. But and I've been very fortunate. I travel the world quite a lot. Looking at other mesothelioma kind of situations and asbestos and so on. And the one thing I would say about our country is that we've got an amazing healthcare system. We've got we do more research into mesothelioma in this country than any other country, I think.
Hmm.
But even that's not enough. The asbestos industry, when I say the asbestos industry, that's all the management, removal, and everything, is second to none. We have the HSE it's under resourced, it could do more, but it is an
Yep.
amazing, amazing, rigorous organisation. So we've got all the key component parts, and we just need to make it better. We just need to help all of that come together to work better to really sort this disease out, really.
My next question is really about what should government and industry do. But to preface that, I just wanted to mention the white paper that was published a couple of years ago by the DWP, and they had some recommendations in there as to what they thought should happen around asbestos. You mentioned the HSE there, fantastic organisation, but as you say, tremendously underfunded, and they just don't have enough inspectors going around to pull people and organisations up on where things are going a little bit wrong. Um, but they also suggested removal of all asbestos within a 40-year time period, as well as a national register. I wondered how do you feel about those recommendations from your chair? And is there anything else that you think government and industry should be doing to tackle this problem?
We need to have a national task force that focuses on the whole asbestos journey issue, from how we manage it to how we look after people that are dying as a consequence of it. So I think we need a national task force. I think it should be cross party. I think it should be, you know, public inquiry that doesn't stop until the deaths stop, because they're unnecessary deaths. And I think that we should have ring fence money for research. I think we should have a national clinical audit so that we know how we're looking after these people. It shouldn't be left to a charity like Mesothelioma UK to fund specialist nurses,
Yeah.
and research and audit. So I think that, a lot of this could be reviewed, and we could have a plan of action. And it doesn't matter if that plan of action takes 20, 30, 40, 50 years, even 100 years. It doesn't matter. It just matters that we make it matter, that we focus on it, and for generations in the future. Because if we're not, we're just kicking it down the road.
Yeah.
Even landfill, we know that there is the technology available to recycle asbestos using high thermal intensive, heat.
Mhm.
Sorry, it's not my bag, but we have a way to dispose of asbestos safely and make it, and get rid of it through thermal recycling. And yet we still stick it in the ground, and 20 years down the line, we start to build on that land and we dig it all up again, and we expose another generation. You know, we have to invest, because 5,000 people a year dying is just shocking. And yes, it's going to take years to start to bring that number down, but that doesn't matter. We still have to, you know, all come together around the table: the asbestos industry, the healthcare workers, the policy makers, the training people, the patients, the families affected. And we just have to have a plan in place that
Yeah.
every government from here on in, uh, takes on and continues to work with.
I couldn't agree with more. I think that it's the time has come really, I think, to have, as you say, a task force. How that's formed and where and who is part of that task force, I think is probably up for debate. But I think um, we seem to be going at it a little bit disparately, a little bit half cocked, for want of a better expression. I think the re- the recommendations in the DWP white paper were, I think, well-meaning, but not necessarily are going to actually tackle the problem. I think the idea of putting a time limit to remove all asbestos is just opening the door to, you know, dramatic drops in standards, in a race to meet that 40-year timescale. And we've seen over the last 40 years, the standards in the 80s and 90s were woeful. We're going back to re-clean lots of areas that should have been cleaned then and weren't done properly. We don't want to end up in that position again in a race to make loads of money and a race to meet the 40-year timescale. It's not the right answer. ATAC produced a very good set of figures about how much asbestos in terms of number of ACMs had been recorded over or in the data that was available to them, and how many of them are recorded as being damaged in some way, and repeatedly so. People are going back to the same sites over and over again and seeing the same asbestos in the same condition it was last time it was looked at. It was in poor condition then, it's still in poor condition now. So nothing's being done. And as you say, that's just kicking the problem down the
Yeah,
road. It happens all the time in our industry. Let's just shut the door. It's a little used area. We don't need to do anything with it. Well, you do, because it's those little used areas, the areas with less foot traffic, that are the places where tradespeople go and do some sort of work. These are the areas of boiler rooms and service ducts and risers, the darker places of buildings where the public don't go. But that's exactly where tradespeople are going to go and carry out some kind of maintenance work or whatever they might be doing. We're putting them at risk every single day because we're prioritizing public areas over the areas where people are actually getting exposed. And this whole priority assessment in the legislation, in the guidance, that actually is skewing this effort. I think if people were just looking purely at what's the risk from this piece of asbestos, what's this inherent risk, It's a high risk material like insulating board or insulation or spray coatings. It's in a poor condition. Well, then you should be mandated to do something about that. It shouldn't really be left because it's only going to get damaged again. And anybody in my industry will tell you you can protect asbestos for a time, but sooner or later somebody is going to accidentally break it and put themselves and others at risk.
Well, your example of the cleaner, that's a you know, a prime example really that that's somebody who has probably never been educated about asbestos, how widespread it is in our country, how dangerous it is. And, I just think that, I mean, some of the things that we would like to see, I mean, apart from support for our nurses and for national audit and so on, and for helping us to establish better, getting better organised with clinical teams. But the other things we'd like to see that are low cost is every every public sector worker, let's start with them because, the NHS is a massive employer, the education system, the armed forces. Everybody who enters any three of those should have, at the start of employment in their health and safety induction training, some asbestos awareness training.
Yeah.
Every single one of them should have that. And then every 3 years, an update. I think that every NHS hospital, every school should have an asbestos champion and a reporting mechanism so that if in your work environment you see a damaged wall or you see cracks down the side of the door frame and dust coming out, anything at all, then you have a number you ring. I want to report an asbestos alert. I'm concerned about it. I think that every healthcare professional in our country, and those trained in the armed forces and those trained in the NHS, we all should have training about asbestos and the diseases it causes to improve our index of suspicion when we're examining patients and consulting with patients. I think we should have access to asbestos registers on the outside of buildings. And I think the National Register is a way to do that. Um, and then let's tackle the bigger issues. Let's tackle the big, but these are things we could do. I have to do, like I say, health and safety training every 3 years. 3 or 4 slides in there about, asbestos. I've looked after colleagues that have worked in the same hospital as me that have died of meso. That can't be right.
No, that's shocking.
It's just, and colleagues who have no idea about the dangers, posed in their work environment. So I think there are some easy wins that we could introduce, but the longer term and whether I agree putting a timeline on it probably isn't helpful, but it got people talking. It
I
did.
think that's the point, yeah.
Yeah,
It got people talking,
yeah,
and I
yeah,
think that's as good a result as we can expect.
yeah.
And, I mean, I completely agree with you in terms of the training. I know we have a very well established and mature asbestos industry, which involves consultants, analysts,
It is
laboratories,
amazing. Very proud
removal
of them
companies,
all.
and so on, who do a tremendous amount of work every single day. I do think that um, we've lost the impetus in terms of training. I think we're so it's not by any sort of deliberate means. I think we live in a world where technology is being utilized to help us on every aspect of our lives, and it in tremendously great and positive ways. But it does take away the focus sometimes from things that we should be focused on. So training, for example, has gone online. We've got lots of online training for all sorts of aspects of work related training, of health and safety, working at height, HR, mental health, and asbestos, of course, is in there as an asbestos awareness training. But it's online. Can we really expect that that's going to deliver quality training to those that really need it? Um, I'm not convinced that that's the right way. I think we should really be looking to have better face-to-face training for those that are at higher risk, for the tradespeople working every day in buildings and maintenance staff. Um, and I think you're right to it. We should extend all of that to everybody, and that should be part of a management plan anyway. In terms of if you're an organisation with 100 staff working in 3 different buildings, everybody should have a part to play in making sure those buildings are safe.
Yeah.
And that's the spirit of the Health and Safety at Work Act anyway. Everyone's responsible for their own health and safety, as well as the employer being responsible for their health and safety of the employees. So it should be this two-way conversation, and employees and staff should be involved. No matter whether you like to be exposed or not, it's a cultural thing, isn't it? And I think we really need to tackle that right from the start.
I think the workplace is where we start. And I think the public sector workplace for me is the actual first starting point. Public sector
Yeah,
workplace, then the workplace. But I would be, I would not be giving voice to all of the patients that, we meet and the people I've cared for if I didn't mention, let's not forget housing, particularly social housing. We've had devastating calls from people who have had council workers in to do a repair in their council property who have left because they've come across asbestos and disturbed it. I remember one single mum with 2 children, and it was a leak in the airing cupboard, in a leak in the water tank above her child's bedroom, and the council workers came in and there was dust, the ceiling had come down, there was a mess everywhere, and they left and said, we can't work there, that's asbestos. And this was a single mum with children. There was dust all over her child's bed, and she didn't know where to start. Didn't know where to start, and she rang us, absolutely desperate, because to replace all of that carpet bedding, that was her food budget for the week or month. That was what that how how bad a situation is this for me? Do I
yeah,
need to forgo feeding my family to address this? And so let's not forget about housing. I think we've also had numerous calls about water pipes. A dreadful proportion of our water pipes are still made of asbestos, and we've had people who have tested their own water and found asbestos in the water. But it's lower down the pecking order in terms of priority because we've got much bigger fish to fry. But we mustn't forget about the dangers that poses. And then finally, there is a lot of concern about talcum powder, and we use a lot of products with talc, face makeup from, you know, all powder products. And there is a lot of concern about talc because talc, some experts would say it's impossible to have talc that's not contaminated with asbestos. So I agree with you that, looking at, asbestos management in the workplace and in our public sector areas is a priority. But we've got a lot of issues. We've got so many issues to address. That's just the tip of the iceberg.
it is. So, on moving on to a final question for today. I'm sure that we could go on like this for
Yeah,
probably
yeah.
episode after episode, but um, I think let's finish on a message, if we can. What one message would you like to give to anybody working in the property industry or the construction industry, anybody working in the public sector, I guess, or those that are in charge of the public sector? I want to try and focus in on those that are responsible for looking after all of these buildings that we all go to work in every day. What message would you like to give to those people responsible for it and to those that are working in those areas?
I want people to know that our current approach to managing asbestos is inadequate, because I look after people dying through exposure that has happened since those regulation and the way we manage it was imposed or brought in. So the current management of asbestos is inadequate. I want people to do everything they can to raise the profile of our country's dreadful asbestos legacy, and demand at every opportunity that the government make it a priority, that we actually do a full root and branch review of the UK's asbestos legacy and bring together a team of experts, a genuine task force that isn't going to stop until we start to see a radical decline in numbers. And that will take years. That will take years. How can, you know, a starry-eyed nurse in her 30s starting out with that ambition to support the people with mesothelioma, and was told at the time that we'd reached the peak in a few years and then it'll all be downhill from there on in. 40,000 people later, the numbers have come down a little bit, but 2,500 people a year, and that's just meso. And we really don't know the true figure for every asbestos disease, because we don't know the true number of diseases attributed to asbestos, ovarian cancer, esophageal cancer. We've got to do something. We've got to do something and stick with the plan until we start to see those numbers fall.
I think if there's anything that I'd like to say, I would say that the legislative framework that we have, I don't think it needs to change drastically. I think it says everything that you should do. Find where your asbestos is. Make sure you've got a very robust plan to make sure people can't accidentally break it and disturb it, and make sure no one's being put at risk on a daily basis. And for the high risk stuff, you really need to start planning. That should be part of your PPM. You should be starting to really get to grips with getting rid of asbestos that's of a high risk nature. And I think if you are at all engaged in construction, refurbishment, property development, looking after property at all, then you're responsible. You are responsible for the safety of those people. It's okay. We're looking at people falling over, falls from a height you mentioned earlier, and obviously that's a given, and you can see the results of that immediately. But don't go and exposing people to asbestos, because you could just as easily be killing them with that. You're just not going to see the outcome until 15, 20 years from now. So you're responsible for people's safety, not just now, but in 20 years' time. And I think the last message is for anybody else. Be informed. Make sure you're aware. You're just as an employee, you're just as responsible for your health and safety as your employer is. So be informed, educate yourself, especially if you're in a high risk industry where you're going into people's buildings and doing work. Don't just settle for an online training course. Go and find out some more about asbestos and its effects. Start with Mesothelioma UK. They've got a great website. Look at the health and safety executives website as well. There's lots of information to be found. So that would be my final message for everybody. And I think the last message, of course, is let's support Mesothelioma UK and
Yes, please.
make sure that Liz and her team can carry on doing this fantastic work. I don't think the phrase "not all heroes wear capes" could ever be more appropriate than for Liz. So I want to thank you, Liz, for coming on the podcast today. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you, and I hope maybe next year we'll get you back on for another chat, and hopefully we can have some better news.
Yes, be nice to think so, wouldn't it? Well, thank you. I mean, the more we can do to raise the profile, the better, and what better way than doing this? So thank you for the invite, and I look forward to coming back.
It'd be great. Thanks, Liz. Thanks again.
All right, thanks. Bye-bye.
That's it for this episode of Comply or Die. Thanks again to Liz for joining us. She is truly inspirational. If something we discussed resonated with you, why not like, share, or follow the show? And if you want to join the discussion or have a story that deserves a spotlight, why not connect with me? I'd love to have you on the podcast. And here's a not so gentle reminder. If you want to support the fantastic work of Mesothelioma UK, check out their website and see how you can help. Perhaps your team could volunteer or you could help with their fundraising. Thanks for tuning in. Catch you next time on Comply or Die.